The tooth had been loose for days, wiggling slightly whenever he pressed his tongue against it. It was one of the molars near the back, stubbornly clinging on despite the others before it having already fallen out with much less resistance. His mother had warned him not to pull it too soon, but the feeling of it dangling half attached was unbearable. So, in the quiet of his room, with the door shut and the dim light of his bedside lamp flickering, he gripped it between his fingers and yanked. A sharp sting ran through his gums, followed by the faint taste of iron. He winced, swallowing hard as he examined the small white tooth in his palm. A tiny, perfect thing, now disconnected from him forever. A little smear of blood clung to the root. He turned to his nightstand, reaching for a crumpled tissue to press against his gum. The bleeding had already slowed, leaving only a dull ache in its place. Satisfied, he placed the tooth carefully under his pillow, the way he always had, since he was little. Even though he was getting older and no longer truly believed in the tooth fairy, there was something comforting about the tradition. Something that made the loss feel less like losing a piece of himself and more like an offering, trade. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on his wall. Outside, the wind howled softly against the window, branches tapping faintly against the glass. He crawled into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin, his fingers brushing briefly against the pillow under which the tooth rested. The thought of it being there, nestled beneath his head, made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite explain. But he told himself it was nothing, just an old childhood habit he was outgrowing. As he lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his mind wandered. He imagined the small tooth vanishing in the night, replaced by a crisp bill or a shiny coin. He thought about the stories he used to believe, the fairy creeping into the room unseen, slipping tiny fingers beneath his pillow. He imagined something smaller than a person, but bigger than a bug, something that could fit into the spaces between shadows. His eyelids grew heavy, the faint pain in his gums fading as exhaustion overtook him. The wind outside carried a low whisper through the cracks in the window, almost like a voice too soft to hear. The boy drifted into sleep, his breath slowing, the weight of his body sinking deeper into the mattress. Unseen, the room around him remained still. The door remained shut. The clock ticked onward, marking the passage of time. And beneath the pillow, the tooth waited. Certainly. Here's the 5,000-word main part of your story. Morning came too soon, the daylight creeping through the edges of the curtains, casting long, pale streaks across the floor. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering open to the soft light. The room, still and quiet, was the same as it had been the night before. The bed was warm, his blanket a comforting weight against his body. He groaned softly, the remnants of sleep clinging to his mind like a fog. His tongue instinctively touched the spot where its molar had been, the tender spot of his gum still aching slightly, but the tooth was no longer there. For a moment, confusion settled over him. He was certain he had placed it under his pillow, as he always did, but when he reached down to check, the space beneath his pillow was empty. His heart skipped a beat. Maybe he had simply forgotten, or maybe it had fallen out of place in his sleep. But as his fingers brushed against the soft fabric of his pillowcase, he noticed something strange. The sensation was wrong, like something was wedged between the mattress and the pillow. He hesitated, pulling the pillow aside slowly, half expecting to find a coin or a note left by the Tooth Fairy. What he saw instead was not what he had expected. At first, it was just the smallest glimpse, a flash of white, something sharp and familiar. His breath caught in his throat as he looked closer, seeing the outline of what seemed to be another tooth. It was just the tip of it at first, poking out from beneath the bed frame, caught in the soft morning light. But as he tugged the pillow completely away and knelt beside the bed to get a better look, he saw more. There, scattered along the floor beneath the bed, were dozens of small, white teeth. Some were whole, others cracked and chipped, their edges worn and stained. They were in a messy pile, some scattered haphazardly, others carefully arranged in a strange pattern that he couldn't quite understand. He swallowed hard, his stomach turning with unease. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign that he might be imagining things, but there were no other signs of anything out of place. The room was exactly as he had left it, save for the teeth beneath his bed. His mind raced. He had never heard of anything like this before. He had heard stories of the Tooth Fairy taking teeth, of them being left as payment in exchange for a small gift, but never anything like this. Why would there be so many under his bed, and where had they come from? He hesitated for a long moment, his fingers lingering on the edge of one of the teeth. It looked like his, but it felt wrong. There was an uncanny quality to it, as though it was too smooth, too perfect to be real. His heart pounded in his chest, and he backed away, standing up quickly. The floor creaked beneath him as he moved, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had to tell someone, but the thought of explaining what he had seen seemed impossible. No one would believe him, he was sure of that. They would laugh at him, say he was imagining things, but the teeth were still there. They couldn't be ignored. He took a step backward, his gaze still fixed on the pile beneath the bed. For a moment, he thought he saw one of them twitch, just slightly. A shiver ran down his spine, and he quickly turned away, not willing to look any longer. The day passed in a haze. He tried to push the strange discovery out of his mind, but it clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Whenever he glanced at the bed, his eyes would dart nervously to the space underneath it, as though expecting the teeth to somehow move or grow. But nothing happened. By the time evening came, the sun setting low in the sky, he had convinced himself it was nothing more than a strange dream or some trick of his mind. He hadn't gone back to check under the bed, hadn't dared to disturb the pile. Maybe he had just imagined it in his sleep. After all, the human mind was capable of all sorts of things when it was half dreaming. But as night fell and he prepared for bed, the unease crept back. His eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but his mind remained alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The quiet of the room seemed too still, too unnatural. Even the wind had stopped, leaving an eerie silence hanging in the air. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around himself. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper, stretching across the walls. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the house settling in for the night. Then the whispering started. At first, it was so faint that he wasn't sure he had heard it. A soft murmur, almost like the rustling of paper, a voice too far away to make out the words. He froze, straining his ears, unsure whether it was real or just another figment of his imagination. But then clearer this time, the whisper came again. "You have so many left." His blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable now, not his own thoughts, but something separate, something foreign. He held his breath, feeling his heart begin to race. The whisper seemed to be coming from beneath the bed, from the very spot where the pile of teeth had been. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself it was just the wind or the house creaking again. But the voice persisted, low and insistent, like it was speaking directly into his ear, even though there was no one else in the room. "You have so many left." A cold sweat broke out across his skin, and he pulled the blankets up around his neck, his body trembling. He had to get up, had to check again. But his legs felt like they were made of stone. Every inch of his body screamed to stay still, to hide under the covers, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But the voice wouldn't stop. "You have so many left." The boy slowly turned his head toward the side of the bed, his eyes flicking toward the dark space beneath it. His breath caught in his throat. He had heard something moving, something soft, scraping against the floor. It was too quiet, too subtle to be anything natural, like the sound of something dragging across the carpet. Something sharp, something alive. With a surge of terror, he leapt from the bed, his feet slamming against the floor as he rushed to the door. His heart was pounding in his chest as he fumbled with the doorknob, desperate to escape. The whispering grew louder, now mixed with the sound of something scratching, something crawling in the darkness beneath him. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, his body shaking uncontrollably as he stumbled into the hallway. But when he looked back toward his bedroom, he saw something that froze him in place. There, in the doorway, was the figure of a shadow, tall and thin, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to reach out toward him. Its face was obscured by darkness, but he could feel its eyes on him, cold and unblinking. The whispering stopped. All that was left was the sound of his ragged breathing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, waiting. And then, from somewhere deep within the darkness of the room, a single tooth rolled out from under the bed and landed on the floor with a soft click. The boy's stomach turned as he backed away, his feet stumbling over the floor, his mind screaming for him to run. But the figure didn't move. It didn't need to, because the teeth were coming. "I hope this fits your needs. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments." The boy's heart thundered in his chest as he stared at the dark figure in the doorway. The world seemed to collapse around him, leaving nothing but the unyielding presence of that shadow standing just outside his room. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he could feel the blood rushing to his ears, drowning out everything else. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to escape, but his legs felt frozen to the floor. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It stood there in eerie silence, as if waiting for something, watching him with eyes that didn't need to be seen to be felt. The boy's stomach twisted into knots as his gaze flickered back to the floor where the tooth had rolled out from under the bed, its sharp edge glinting in the dim light. For a moment, he thought it might all be a hallucination, a nightmare brought to life, a trick of his overworked mind. But the cold, clammy sweat that covered his skin told him otherwise. The dark presence in the doorway was real, and the teeth under the bed, they weren't just a mistake, a freak occurrence. They were something else entirely. Without thinking, he turned and ran. His feet pounded against the wooden floorboards, each step echoing in the empty hall. His body surged forward, the door to the stairs within reach. But as he reached out for the doorknob, a sound from behind made him stop dead in his tracks. The whispering had started again. "You have so many left." The voice was no longer faint. It was clear. It was close, almost too close. It slithered into his ears, worming its way into his brain, filling every empty space with a cold, creeping dread. His body stiffened, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as if every fiber of his being was telling him to turn around. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed. A faint scratching sound filled the room, too soft to be a person, but sharp enough to pierce through his thoughts. It was as if something was moving, something impossibly large, something made entirely of teeth and shadows, scuttling on the floor behind him. The boy closed his eyes, unable to stop the tremors that ran through his limbs. When he opened them again, the room was darker. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist as though they were alive, moving and growing. His stomach turned with a sickening realization the room had changed. It wasn't the same room he had been in moments ago. It felt wrong. A wave of nausea washed over him as he took a hesitant step back, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The walls were closing in. The ceiling seemed to lower. The floor seemed to ripple, as if it were made of water, undulating beneath his feet. And in the center of it all, beneath the bed, the pile of teeth had grown. It wasn't just a few scattered teeth anymore. There were hundreds, thousands packed together in a writhing mass, sharp and white and gleaming in the dim light. They covered the floor like a living carpet, shifting and clattering as if they were searching for something. A single tooth rolled toward him, its edge catching the light as it stopped just at his feet. His heart hammered in his chest. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices all saying the same thing over and over again. "You have so many left." The boy felt its breath catch in his throat. His legs buckled beneath him, and he crumpled to the floor, his hands reaching out for something, anything, to steady himself. The pile of teeth seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm, as though it were breathing, as though it were alive. The shadows in the room shifted, and he realized with horror that the figure was no longer just standing in the doorway. It had moved. It was closer now, its form more solid, more defined. It was taller than before, looming over him like a dark tower, its limbs long and twisted, ending in jagged claw-like fingers that scraped against the floor with a sound like nails on chalkboard. The boy tried to move, to scream, but his voice was gone. His throat was tight, constricted by fear, by something else, something cold and ancient that seemed to hold him in place. The figure's face remained hidden in the shadows, but he could feel its gaze upon him, cold and unblinking. It wasn't just watching him, it was waiting. The whispering stopped. The figure didn't speak, but somehow the words rang out in his mind, clear as day. "It's time." The boy's heart skipped a beat. The room seemed to twist, the floor beneath him giving way as the shadows reached out, pulling him toward the pile of teeth. His limbs flailed, his fingers grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing but the cold, biting darkness. And then, in an instant, it all happened. The teeth surged toward him, the pile shifting and moving like a wave crashing on the shore. They clattered and scraped, sharp edges digging into his skin, sinking into his flesh with a sickening sensation. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, the room closing in around him. In the midst of the chaos, something else began to change. The teeth didn't just hurt. They weren't just attacking him. They were pulling something from him. It was as though they were feeding, drawing something deep inside of him. Something he couldn't see, but something he could feel being torn away piece by piece. His chest tightened and the pain intensified. He tried to claw at the teeth, but it was no use. They kept coming, kept pulling, kept taking. He could feel his body weakening, his strength draining away with each passing moment. But then, amidst the searing pain, something else began to happen. The teeth stopped moving, the room stopped shifting, the whispering ceased, everything went still. For a long, agonizing moment, he lay there, his body trembling, his skin covered in cold sweat. He didn't dare move, didn't dare open his eyes. He was afraid that if he did, the nightmare would start again. But when he finally dared to open his eyes, the room was empty. The shadows were gone, the teeth were gone, the figure was gone. And in the silence, he realized something terrifying. He was no longer alone. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror, but it was wrong. His eyes were dark, his skin pale and sickly, the once innocent face now twisted with something darker, something that wasn't him. His mouth opened, but instead of his voice, there was a sound, something unfamiliar, something hollow. He looked down at his hands, and in the dim light, he saw them, the teeth. They were there, embedded in his skin, sharp and white, the roots digging deep beneath his flesh. "You have so many left?" the voice whispered again. And as the boy stared at his reflection, the last remnants of his humanity slipped away, leaving only the hollow echo of his former self.